Welcome to the second episode of Preserving the Republic, a dialogue. I'm your host, Aaron, and today I want to start out by discussing the history of fascism, but also providing a high-level definition of fascism. How do we define fascism at a high level? I think it's important to understand that there are many different aspects of fascism. The first important thing to understand about fascism is that it's a far right-wing ideology. In fact, it is right-wing authoritarianism and is really a conservative political view taken to the extremes. I think that often people, especially those with right-wing viewpoints, tend to confuse the idea that fascism is left-wing because the most well-known implementation of fascism is probably Nazism as led under Hitler. And of course, Nazism is simply a shortened version of the full party name, which is National Socialism. So of course it might be easy to get fascism confused with being a left-wing ideology. After all, socialism by its very nature is a left-wing ideology. But really, if you understand the history of fascism, you'll understand that Hitler really co-opted the term. And I am no way advocating for a far-left communist or socialist viewpoint, but the reality is that fascism is on the right wing, not the left wing. In fact, fascism oppresses and opposes the left wing, including communism and socialism, because it views it as a risk for overthrowing an authoritarian regime that knows best for the people. In fact, fascism actually supports capitalism, with the caveat that the capitalists, or in other words, corporate business interests, support the regime. Fascism also opposes democracy in favor of a strong-arm leader, and that strong-arm leader tends to be put forth as someone who has all of the solutions to the major problems that a country is facing. Additionally, fascism is ultra-nationalist. In other words, national interests are put at the forefront above all else at the neglect of the individual. Additionally, fascism involves the promotion of specific racial and ethnic groups, and by its very nature, the exclusion of others. A fascist supports a pure race and a pure nation, and opposing and oppressing minority groups is framed as a way to fight to protect the nation against others. Additionally, fascism involves having an expansionist foreign policy to advance the strong nation. This includes supporting a strong military that is used to invade other countries. And the goal of invading other countries is to promote your own country, to advance its goals, and to create a stronger national government. And so in order to advance these goals, a fascist regime always supports having a strong military. And finally, a fascist regime also implements a paramilitary style of policing. And it does such to fight internal enemies. Some of these are the minority groups that I talked about earlier, but it also fights against political enemies and suppresses individual rights. In other words, a fascist views a diversity of political ideas as a risk to the nation state. Because if an individual rises up and comes up with new ideas that opposes the fascists, it puts the nation at risk of not living up to the potential that it has. Basically, an individual with new or different political ideologies risks the nation failing. And so given this short definition, it's very high level, I want to dive into a short history of where fascism came from. So fascism as a political ideology arose in the late 1800s, but really didn't become a major player within countries until after World War I. In 1919, Mussolini founded the National Fascist Party in Italy. And by 1922, Mussolini had staged a massive armed march to Rome where he seized power. I think it's important to understand that he was able to build popular support through this march, but that he also overthrew what was a democratic government. Eventually, fascism spreads throughout much of Europe, of course most famously in Germany with the rise of Nazism and Hitler, but fascism also arose in Spain, Hungary, Romania, Poland, Portugal, Finland, Austria, and Greece. I talked extensively about Germany in episode 1, but fascism's spread accumulated in the start of World War II, when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. And I think that's the biggest historical lesson or takeaway that we can take from the rise of fascism, is that fascism always leads to violence. Given that fascism ideology is expansionist, anytime fascism arises, there will always be invasions of smaller, weaker countries. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why it's so important to fight against fascism or recognize its current rise within the United States, because there's a greater global danger anytime fascism arises anywhere. The risk of a large-scale war is always not that far behind. I also want to talk about the 14 aspects of fascism that I mentioned in episode 1. But before I dive into the details and do a comparative analysis of the 14 traits, I think it's important to contextualize where these traits came from. So just starting out, the 14 traits were first published in an article published by Free Inquiry magazine back in 2003 by Laurence Britt. Laurence Britt is a self-described amateur historian who also published a fictional book about a future fascist America. So I think it's important that I acknowledge that Laurence is not and was never a historian, and that fascism goes deeper than the list of the 14 traits that he came up with. Nonetheless, I think they serve as a useful tool because they help us understand where the dangers of fascism may be taking root. And so in this episode, I want to cover the first 4 of these traits that he outlined back in 2003. So let's start with trait number 1. There is a powerful and continuing nationalism. So under fascism, there is extreme nationalism. The nation is favored above the individual, and the fascist wants to restore the nation to greatness as a result of this nationalism. So what is nationalism anyways? According to Britannica.com, nationalism is an ideology based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation state surpasses any other individual or group interests. So in other words, the advancement of a nation takes priority above anything else. And so naturally under fascism, support for a strongman leader tends to emerge, and all power goes to or is coalesced under a single person or a small group of people who wants to restore a nation to greatness. Does that sound familiar? Make America great again. It's a catchy slogan. It has positive implications. After all, who wouldn't want their country to be great? Make America great again implies a restoration of America to a past, a glorious previous America. Trump has not only used the slogan, Make America Great Again, but he's also campaigned on being American first, or supporting America first policies. In other words, Trump's ideology views the world as a zero-sum game, where the United States is facing off against everyone else in the world. And this idea shapes Trump's foreign policy and economic policies, especially with concern to his support for tariffs. Not only is the nation favored above the individual, but in this case, America is seen as superior to the rest of the world. Trump himself has said he is a nationalist. At one of his campaign events, Trump said, quote, "You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called nationalist." And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word? You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist. President Trump later clarified that he wasn't referring to white nationalism. Rather, he claimed he used the word to explain how he loves America and wants the country to be treated fairly and with respect on the global stage. But even if we take him at his word, that he was more specifically talking about a nationalist promotion of America, it still fits in with the nationalist aspect of fascism. And so on that note, I think it's important to understand the difference between patriotism and nationalism. And I think it's really hard to differentiate the two because they're somewhat similar. And of course, in the United States, patriotism is very, very common. Patriotism is a love and devotion to one's country. But a part of that patriotism is respecting other countries' sovereignty and laws. And so one can be patriotic, love one's country, without the desire to take over other countries in order to promote your own nation. And that, in and of itself, is the delineator, in my opinion. Nationalism, on the other hand, is a love and devotion to one's country above all other countries. In other words, there's that superiority complex associated with nationalism. You not only love your country, but you believe that your country is the best and that your country should do all that it can to ensure the best outcomes for your country, even if other countries are harmed. As I referenced under my brief overview of the history of fascism, nationalism, especially extreme nationalism, often leads to violence and war. And I think it's important to understand that this strong nationalism was one of the major factors that led to both World War I and World War II. Nationalism is exclusionary. It's a us versus them competition. It's a zero-sum game where if I hurt another country, my own country is able to advance. And nationalism also tends to ignore the laws of other countries and international law, which, if you believe your country is superior to all others, it's natural to ignore the laws of other countries because you believe your nation is the greatest and therefore deserves to be able to ignore other countries in order to advance your own nation's interests. A recent example of how Trump is a nationalist and is not just purely a patriot, and yes, I would say that most politicians in the United States are patriotic. Now, I know that there's people on the right wing that would probably debate my use of that term, but I think it's fair to say that, at least taken at face value, most politicians claim to love the United States and therefore are patriotic. But the Trump administration has taken this to nationalist extremes, especially when you take into context their actions in Venezuela. The U.S. military used force and captured Venezuela dictator Nicolas Maduro and his wife. I want to be very clear that I refuse to call Maduro a president. Maduro was not democratically elected, and I think that's something that conservatives have a fair point on. But regardless, removing a dictator and bringing him to the United States under the guise of charging him for involvement with drug trafficking is a very clear case where the United States is ignoring Venezuelan law, but also international law. At an emergency meeting with the UN Security Council held in the days before the intervention, several council members identified the operation as a violation of the UN Charter and international law. This included the non-aligned movement composed of 125 states. Russia was given the unedifying opportunity to present itself as a defender of the international prohibition of force, despite its illegal armed invasion of Ukraine. Now again, I think it's important for me to cede an argument to conservatives in the sense that often international law is meaningless, and this is a perfect example where Russia itself has invaded another country, Ukraine, and yet they are pretending to be advocates for Venezuela and in their opposition to the United States, taking action in Venezuela. They're hypocrites. But nonetheless, it's still a violation of international law. Russia violated international law, and the United States has violated international law with its actions in Venezuela. And not only has Trump removed Maduro from power in Venezuela, but he's also promised that the United States will take over control of the Venezuela government. And so in that sense, he is very clearly ignoring Venezuelan sovereignty. I think in the past, neoconservatives or people with neoconservative viewpoints might argue that the United States should take action and use our military to advance not only the United States' interests, but also to advance democracy in the world. It's a very common argument that's been used in the past. And if that's all we were talking about, then I would say that it's simply a difference in opinion on how foreign policy should be implemented from the executive branch. The difference is that Trump, again, is purporting to take over control of the Venezuelan government. And so, in other words, he's completely ignoring Venezuelan sovereignty, and he's not pretending to have, quote unquote, kidnapped Maduro in order to advance democracy. On a personal level, and I talked about this a little bit in episode 1, I would consider myself to be patriotic, but I am not a nationalist. To my left-wing friends, I acknowledge that the United States isn't perfect. It never has been. And the United States has caused great harm throughout our history. In fact, I think it's impossible for any superpower, or empire really, and let's be real, to my conservative friends, the United States is an empire. No empire has ever existed without causing harm from a historical context. But I also believe that the United States has done great good. I'm proud of our constitutional democracy, but I'm not inherently proud to be an American just because I happen to have been born here. I love America because it has the potential to be great, but America is not superior to all other countries. I want to jump back to the concept of a strongman leader under extreme nationalism, because this concept under fascism basically says that a strong-arm leader is needed to return a nation to glory. In the United States, there has been a general shift of power away from courts and Congress, and this power has shifted to the president. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this did not start with Trump. In fact, I agree with many conservatives who have raised this point before, usually under the Obama administration, but nonetheless, their point is fair. This expansionist shift to the executive branch really began with FDR and his expansion of executive powers as implemented under his New Deal programs. And so ignoring whether or not FDR's New Deal programs were good or not, there's a fair debate to be had between the left and the right on that front on how it's best to address economic problems. But nonetheless, at the time, the Supreme Court ruled many of FDR's New Deal programs as being unconstitutional, until FDR threatened to stuff the court, at which point the court capitulated power to the president. Since then, the president has steadily increased their power over time, but I think it's important to note that Trump is blatantly increasing his power to a greater degree compared to all previous presidents before him. And I think the best example of this is how Trump has ignored court orders, especially when it comes to immigration. Again, I think it's important to note that there can be a reasonable debate between people with different perspectives about how and when to enforce immigration laws. And it's not, I would say to my friends who are on the left wing of the political spectrum, that simply opposing illegal immigration does not make someone an extreme nationalist, or even does not even signal an extreme takeover of power by the executive branch. But the way the Trump administration has implemented its opposition to illegal immigration is what signals a shift in power to the executive branch. So I think one of the highest profile examples of this is the deportation of Kilmer Abrego Garcia. In essence, Trump delayed complying with court orders to return Garcia to the United States from El Salvador. For context, Garcia was essentially deported to El Salvador without a hearing, and he ignored multiple court orders. He even argued that once Garcia was in El Salvador, the United States no longer had jurisdiction, and therefore could no longer return him to the United States to face a fair hearing under a judge. But there's broader context to Trump's ignoring this specific court order. According to the Washington Post, as of July 21st, 2025, the Trump administration has ignored or subverted 35% of lawsuits where judges have sided against the administration. In other words, there's been lawsuits against the Trump administration in various different aspects. And in fact, this is a key way that the separation of powers comes into play, because the courts are able to essentially act as a check against the executive branch. And yet, the Trump administration has flat out ignored 35% of these lawsuits where judges have essentially ruled against the administration. That's not normal. And again, it's a strong indicator of how the Trump administration has essentially seized power or increased the executive branch's power to a far greater extent compared to previous administrations. Trait 2. Under a fascist regime, there is a disdain for human rights. Just starting out with this aspect, I hope I don't need to define human rights. In fact, there was a fairly famous case in the United States that was referring to obscenity laws. There's a common phrase by a conservative judge in that case where he said basically that you know it when you see it. And I think that the same is true when it comes to human rights violations. As a citizen, especially a citizen of a democracy, you know when human rights are being ignored and abused. So there's been a few examples of the Trump administration violating human rights. And the first I want to talk about is the famous alligator Alcatraz. Now I know that this is a kind of a trope at this point, but according to The Guardian, detainees of the notorious Florida immigration jail, known as Alligator Alcatraz, have been shackled inside 2-foot-high metal cages and left outside without water for up to a day at a time. Detainees were shackled with their hands tied behind their backs and made to kneel to eat food from styrofoam plates like dogs. To be clear, I understand that people with a conservative perspective are much more likely to support punishment from the criminal justice perspective. And just because someone who is conservative supports strict punishments doesn't necessarily mean that they support violation of human rights. But I think in this case, it's very clear that the conditions at the jail are far beyond what any reasonable person would say is a reasonable punishment. In fact, I would argue that it's a violation of our Constitution, because our Constitution bars cruel and unusual punishment. Being outside without water alone, to me, is enough to be considered cruel and unusual punishment. Another example of Trump's violation of human rights includes the current actions of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security, and other federal immigration enforcement. Now, as I alluded to earlier, there can be a reasonable debate between liberals and conservatives in the United States in how immigration law should be enforced, whether it should be stricter or more open. And I'm not here to debate which one is better versus the other, but it's the implementation of Trump's immigration law enforcement that I would argue has violated human rights. Under Trump, ICE has moved to deport more quickly through a process called expedited removal. Illegal immigrants are able to be deported without getting a hearing before a judge. From January 20th to June 26, 2025, 13% of arrested immigrants were labeled as expedited removals, according to the data. And that's up from 3% in the same period under Biden in 2024. Notably, expedited deportation was created under the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, in which Congress outlined very specific circumstances where expedited removal or expedited deportation can be used. And this includes, first, arriving aliens, defined as aliens arriving at the U.S. ports of entry. And so, in other words, it's someone who has immediately crossed into the United States and has been caught. You don't have to give someone who's been caught at the border a hearing. And I think that that's common sense. The second criteria is that aliens who enter the United States by sea without being admitted or patrolled into the United States, who have been in this country for less than 2 years. So in other words, if someone's entered the country illegally in some form and they have not been in the United States for more than 2 years, you can use expedited removal. And the third criteria is that an alien is apprehended within 100 miles of the U.S. border within 14 days of entering the country, and those who have not been admitted or paroled. So given that these three criteria are outlined or were outlined by the law passed by Congress, I think it's very clear that even though Congress passed these rules to provide a way to expedite deportations without immigration hearings by a judge, that this was intended to smooth out the process at the border and to speed things along. The intent of Congress was not for a president to use expedited removal to simply increase deportations overall. I think this increase in expedited removal is a clear indicator that Trump is ignoring due process rights that are guaranteed to all people in the United States by the U.S. Constitution. And I'm not going to get into a debate here. I know that there are conservatives who argue that due process rights should only be applied to U.S. citizens. But for now, I'm not going to argue that point because there have been multiple court rulings that agree that the U.S. Constitution applies to all people in the United States, not just citizens. And until there's a Supreme Court ruling that overturns that precedence, I think it's reasonable to understand that due process rights are guaranteed to all people in the United States, no matter what someone's citizenship status is. According to NPR, as of October 2025, 170 U.S. citizens have been arrested as part of immigration raids. And again, I think we can have a debate in this country about the extent of how immigration law is enforced. But by its very nature, these types of raids should be directed towards non-citizens and people without legal authorization in the United States. And so the fact that U.S. citizens are being arrested by federal agents that are supposed to be enforcing immigration law serves as a real warning flag that people's constitutional rights are being ignored. And so to add additional context to this, there was an ICE memo that was issued back in May of 2025, to be more specific, that said, quote, "Although the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has not historically relied on administrative warrants alone to arrest aliens subject to the final orders of removal in their place of residence, the DHS Office of General Counsel has recently determined that the U.S. Constitution, the Immigration and Nationality Act, and immigration regulations do not prohibit relying on administrative warrants for this purpose." I think it's very important to understand that administrative warrants are not issued by the court system, but rather they're issued by the Department of Homeland Security. So comparing this to normal police operations, this is as if your local police department in your town was able to issue their own warrants. And so, of course, this leads to an abuse of power. There is no check of a judge basically saying, yes, it's reasonable for someone to be able to search someone's property. And so relying on administrative warrants is a clear violation of Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. And because the Fourth Amendment, along with all the rights outlined in the Constitution, applies to all people in the United States, this violation applies even if the people that are being searched are in fact undocumented or illegal immigrants. I also want to talk about some recent events where federal officers killed 2 U.S. citizens. The first is Renee Good. On January 7th, 2026, during a federal immigration enforcement operation in Minneapolis, an ICE agent named Jonathan Ross shot and killed Renee. At the time, Renee was inside her SUV on a residential street. She had just dropped off her youngest child at school and was on her way home. Video and eyewitness accounts show an ICE agent approaching Renee's vehicle and ordering her to exit. Renee briefly reversed and then began moving forward and to the right, seemingly to leave the scene. An ICE agent fired 3 shots, hitting Good multiple times, including in the arm, chest, and head, killing her. Renee's last words to the ICE agents before her death were, "That's fine, dude. I'm not mad at you." Now, we can have a debate in this country about when it's appropriate for any law enforcement to use deadly force. But I think it's clear from the video that I've watched from many different angles that Renee was not attacking this ICE officer. She was fleeing, but she was not attacking this officer, and therefore the use of deadly force was not justified. There's no reason why everything was caught on camera. Any rational police officer would record her license and deal with the problem later. But instead, in this case, an ICE officer decided to open fire, killing Renee, but also putting at risk other bystanders. There's not much else for me to say about this, but extrajudicial executions like this are clearly a violation of a person's rights. The second example is Alex Pretty. Alex Pretty was a 37-year-old American citizen and an ICU nurse who worked in the Minneapolis Veterans Affairs Medical Center. He had no serious criminal record beyond minor traffic offenses and held a lawful gun permit. On January 24th, 2026, during a federal immigration enforcement operation in Minneapolis, 2 U.S. Border Patrol agents fatally shot Preddy. Bystander video reviewed by the Associated Press showed Preddy holding a phone, not a weapon, during much of the encounter. The available footage depicts a chaotic scene in which agents appear to pepper spray and wrestle him to the ground before shots are fired. I think there's important context here. Alex did have a gun with him, but if you review the video footage that's available, and I would encourage everyone to watch it, Preddy's gun is removed before these officers open fire. Preddy's First, Second, and Second Amendment rights were violated in this instance. Preddy had been subdued and acted as no threat to these officers in that moment, and yet he was just another example of an extrajudicial execution. Both of these scenarios show how federal officers are acting under the Trump administration more like a paramilitary force than police officers. And I recognize that there are situations where deadly force is justified, but in my opinion, neither of these cases warranted the use of deadly force. I want to know, to conservatives who would justify these actions by these federal officers, are we at the point in America where ignoring a federal officer's orders and or documenting a federal officer's actions warrants the death penalty? I want to reiterate that Alex was clearly exercising his First Amendment right to free speech and his Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. I believe that protecting both of these rights is vital to maintaining a free America. And this is something that my liberal friends may not agree with me, but the Second Amendment is one issue where I heavily lean conservative. I believe that the Second Amendment, as the courts have ruled over and over, applies to individuals. And of course, there's historical context there. In fact, if you really want to dive into the history, the Bill of Rights was never intended originally to apply to individuals, but eventually the courts expanded those rights to individuals. And so understanding this, the Second Amendment doesn't in fact apply to individuals. And there's been court case after court case after court case that has essentially upheld that individual right. And I think it's ironic that the Trump campaign has, in the past, campaigned on preserving these Second Amendment rights. But in this instance, the Trump administration has in essence argued that Preddy had no right to peacefully carry a gun and exercise his Second Amendment rights. It's despicable that the Trump administration has labeled both Renee and Alex as domestic terrorists. I believe that they are doing so in order to justify a clear violation of constitutional rights, which occurred during both incidents. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that Preddy doesn't have a past. There was a video released recently of him kicking out the taillights of a federal officer's vehicle. Property destruction. You could even argue that that's an attack on an officer, and that would be enough to arrest Preddy and to give him his day in court. But there's nothing that justifies his execution, and there's nothing that justifies the execution of Renee. The third characteristic of fascism involves the identification of enemies and scapegoats as a unifying cause. This involves the suppression of people seen as a threat to the nation, and a vital aspect of this is racism and racial supremacy, which is implicit in oppressing minority groups as a threat. For context, under fascist Nazi Germany, there were attacks on several different minority groups that weren't defined as sufficiently real Germans, which included most famously Jews, but also included sexual minority groups, people who were disabled, among others. As a reminder, a Holocaust does not need to happen for fascism to exist. Genocide does not need to happen for fascism to exist. But using racial views to scapegoat groups for the problems of a country is a key trait of fascism. In my opinion, President Trump is a white supremacist. Now, I understand that that is a very strong claim to make, but I would argue that there are multiple instances that corroborate my claim. This includes a 1973 housing discrimination lawsuit that Trump and his father settled. And for context, in 1973, the civil rights legislation had been passed not too far in the past, and so this is a fairly recent enforcement of those laws. And part of those laws said that Basically, property owners could not discriminate based on race. According to NPR, the 1970 lawsuit was based on evidence gathered by testers for the New York City Human Rights Division, which alleged that black people who went to Trump's buildings were told that there were no apartments available, while white people were offered units. To be fair to Trump, Trump's father and their real estate company settled the lawsuit without ever admitting guilt. But that clause is nearly universal in the settlement of any major lawsuits, especially those that involved large, wealthy individuals and corporations. And so as such, including that clause does not implicate innocence or guilt. The fact is that the New York City Human Rights Division sent in people of different races to available apartments. White applicants were basically shown these apartments and explained that yes, they are available and we'd be happy to rent to you. But black applicants were told that the apartments were no longer available. And so that's very clear evidence of treating a minority group differently. Trump has also made racialized comments. In reference to illegal immigrants, Trump said, quote, "How about allowing people to come through an open border, 13,000 of which were murderers? Many of them murdered far more than one person, and they are now happily living in the United States. You know, now a murderer. I believe this. It's in their genes. And we got a lot of bad genes in our country right now. Then you had 425,000 people come into our country that shouldn't be here that are criminals." Close quote. I've already talked about it in my podcast, but to be fair to my conservative friends, one might argue that his emphasis on the above quote is on illegal immigrants and that Trump's intent didn't include racial undertones. In other words, that Trump simply used poor phrasing when he said bad genes. I assert that Trump did intend the racist language because he's made other racial remarks historically. In reference to Haitian refugees, and I want to emphasize their legal status as refugees, Trump said, quote, "In Springfield, they are eating the dogs. The people that came in, they are eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there," end quote. And these are just two examples of Trump's racist rhetoric. More broadly, the Trump administration released a strategy memo outlining a new national security prioritization. Within that document, the Trump administration said, quote, "Over the long term, it is more than plausible that within a few decades at the latest, certain NATO members will become majority non-European. The Trump administration wants to restore Western identity in Europe." Let me be clear that Western identity is a phrase used by white supremacists interchangeably with white identity. And based on Trump's full quote, it is clear that Trump holds white supremacist views. In other words, his administration has raised a concern with Europe no longer being white. I don't know how much more clear the Trump administration can be in its racial views. And finally, the Trump administration regularly attacks DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Again, I want to be clear, opposing DEI programs does not automatically mean that someone is a racist. Reasonable people can disagree, and I'm actually sympathetic to the core argument of people that oppose DEI because they want people to be evaluated based on merit and not on uncontrollable traits like skin color. But given Trump's racist comments previously, it's clear to me that Trump's opposition to DEI is in fact racist. And in fact, the Trump administration has directed the Civil Rights Division to look for areas where reverse discrimination has occurred, which is a common rhetorical talking point for white supremacists. Again, you don't have to support DEI policies, but when it's tied to the implication that white people are being systematically oppressed and a refusal to enforce civil rights laws for all people, there's a problem there. And there's a very strong implication that Trump's opposition to DEI programs is racist. There's no other argument that I can make here. Again, to my conservative friends, you can oppose DEI policies without being racist. but given the context of the Trump administration and Trump's own rhetoric, his opposition is racial in nature. Trump is a racist. The fourth character trait of fascism is military supremacy. More specifically, this includes the expansion of territory or power through war. This can even include the expansion of a nation's control over natural resources. The best way that I can describe this is that a fascist has an imperialist view of the military and of the globe on a broader stage. The national security strategy outlined Trump's national security priorities, including an argument supporting a revived Monroe Doctrine. Trump basically argues the Western Hemisphere should be under the control of the United States military. Boat strikes in Venezuela and kidnapping Maduro are evidence of the Trump administration's implementation of a new Monroe Doctrine. Trump's actual use of the military clearly shows that the United States is taking a new territorial, expansionist, imperialist use of the military. But Trump's rhetoric also supports this expansionist, militaristic viewpoint. Trump's comments explicitly have pushed for the United States to acquire Greenland, Canada, the Panama Canal, and even Gaza. And to be fair, the US has played an active role as the world's lone superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And my liberal friends might argue that Trump is simply saying the quiet part out loud. I think the Iraq War is the biggest modern example. Many liberals would argue that the only reason why the Bush administration supported war with Iraq was to obtain their oil. I would argue that the situation was more complex than that, and I would give President Bush the benefit of the doubt, and I say that as someone who strongly opposed the Iraq War. But at least within the context of the neocon argument at the time, neocons generally supported the Iraq War, arguing from a standpoint of US and international security. However, Trump has gone further than that. Trump suggested oil seizures related to the Iraq War would be a way to pay for the investment that US taxpayers made to go to war in Iraq. He said, quote, "We go in, we spend $3 trillion, we lose thousands and thousands of lives. And then, what happens is we get nothing. It used to be to the victor belongs the spoils." He added, quote, "One of the benefits we would have had if we took the oil is ISIS would not have been able to take the oil and use that oil to fuel themselves," close quote. Ironically, Trump has campaigned in the past to reduce US military actions around the world, but today he's doing the exact opposite. He's personally advocated for taking Venezuelan oil as a reason for why he bombed Venezuela. And I think under normal circumstances, there can be a reasonable debate to the extent of military intervention in any particular circumstance. I don't think any reasonable person argues that Maduro was a good person or that he was democratically elected by his people. He was a dictator, and as such, naturally abused the human rights of his people. And personally, I tend to lean more towards non-interventionism, although I would not consider myself to be an isolationist. I generally agree with the conservative and Trump argument that the US basically has subsidized European security for decades. But I don't think that we should cut off our aid immediately. And that doesn't mean that we abandon our allies, nor does it mean that the United States military should be used unilaterally to take over territory or obtain resources. A fascist imperialistic military viewpoint increases the danger of country-to-country warfare, but also increases the danger of global warfare. And as I mentioned earlier, this was a major factor that led to World War II. And frankly, it's not necessary. A country can economically dominate the world without using military action to essentially take over territory or resources. When done right, interacting on the global scale, a country can succeed dramatically from an economic perspective. And so really using the military to take over other countries is completely unnecessary. Even if the risk of global warfare wasn't something that could happen under a highly militarized, imperialistic, fascist viewpoint. And yet Trump, in essence, is returning to a pre-World War I. I know there's scholars out there that call it a pre-World War II, but really it's a pre-World War I view of the world, where the world is seen as a stage for empires to fight and battle it out, and that if you don't take over other countries, you are failing your nation. That's a risk that, frankly, I don't think is worth it, and I don't think that the world really wants to see a World War III, which is the path that fascism takes under this type of military supremacy and imperialistic ideas about invading other countries to contain their resources. I think it's obvious the United States military is one of the strongest in the world, and there's no other military that compares. But that doesn't mean that another country couldn't steadily increase their power to the point where a World War III could happen. And that's a risk that, frankly, I'm just not willing to take. I want to acknowledge the negative implications and connotations of what I've talked about so far. I can understand that someone might even feel like giving up because there is no hope. If the United States is on a path towards fascism, and under fascism, individual citizens have no ability to implement change, what's the point? I can understand why someone might even get depressed about this issue. But there are ways to fight fascism and authoritarianism. And I want to talk about some historic examples of where citizens have successfully fought against authoritarianism. Now, a key assumption in this is that fascism is right-wing authoritarianism, but I think that these types of protest and successful opposition can apply no matter what type of authoritarian government is in place. As I mentioned briefly in my first episode, left-wing authoritarianism is just as bad as right-wing authoritarianism. It's just that, in my viewpoint, the Trump administration has basically supported fascist ideology and as such poses the biggest threat as far as us losing our democratic governance in the United States. But examples of citizens fighting back against left-wing authoritarian regimes is just as applicable. So the first example I want to talk about are the Baltics post-Cold War, which was come to be known as the Singing Revolution. The Singing Revolution occurred in the Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Basically, the citizens were fighting against Soviet occupation and control. Notably, the movement was non-violent, and this movement occurred between 1987 and 1991, which ultimately led to the implementation of democratic governments in these three countries, and ultimately, the Soviet Union even officially recognized these three countries. For context, the movement unified through song, including national anthems. And this movement even evolved to rock, choral, and folk songs. All of these songs were banned by the Soviet Union as forms of political expression. There's a quote by an Estonian artist, Heinz Valk, in 1988 that I think sums up clearly why this movement was so driven by music. He said, quote, "A nation which makes its revolution by singing and smiling should be a sublime example to all." In 1989, 1 million Balts joined hands in a well-publicized human chain. And in the summer of 1990, there were 3 national choral song festivals held that were a part of peaceful protests. In January 1991, the Soviet military intervened, focusing on media and communication channels. In fact, at a television tower, Soviet troops forced their way through a wall of civilian defenders, killing 14 and wounding hundreds more. The president of Lithuania, who was democratically elected, said, quote, Look into the eyes of the person who is close to you and sing. Song helped us for many centuries. But let us leave the evil feelings and crimes to them. Let's not pay attention to the shooting. Let's sing." End quote. The Soviet Union ultimately fell in December 1991. And to be fair, there were other factors at play when it came to the fall of the Soviet Union. But I think it's important to note that these three Baltic states would have never been able to overthrow the Soviet Union using violent force. The power differential would have been too great. Had these uprisings been violent, the Soviet Union would have crushed the rebellions. Now, had these rebellions hypothetically turned to violence, it could have turned into a very guerrilla style of warfare that has been seen in Vietnam and Iraq, are just two examples that come to mind, where a great military power was essentially defeated. But that requires that a country cares about the costs of war. And given that the Soviet Union was a left-wing authoritarian regime, I suspect that they would have crushed any violent revolution. And therefore, the singing revolution would have failed had they turned to violence. I think the singing revolution has some core lessons for America today. The first and foremost is that nonviolence can and does work. In fact, nonviolent protest leads to better outcomes in most cases. America has had times in our history where revolution has turned violent. Our original Revolutionary War for independence, in fact, had the colonies lost, would have been described more aptly as a civil war. And even our more recent Civil War had devastating consequences for the United States. I'm not going to sit here and argue for Southern apologists who try to argue that the war was not about slavery, because the war was about slavery. In fact, it was about Southern states' ability to continue to use slavery. And I will not support historical apologism when it comes to the Southern support for the Civil War. But the reality is that the Civil War caused grave devastation, especially for the South. I think that's something that most Northerners, or quote-unquote Yankees, as some of my relatives would refer you to as, that the devastation of the Civil War is still being felt today. The Civil War was very bloody and long, but it also destroyed economies. And the South, in my opinion, never really recovered from that Civil War. In fact, I would argue that the Civil War is one of the reasons for why the South in general tends to be much poorer than other places in the United States. That the violence of war essentially set them back 100 years. And so violence has grave consequences, even when that violence is being used to support basic human rights. If there's a way to support change through nonviolent action, I believe that that should be the first option. And I think it's important to acknowledge that if there were a civil war occurred today, that it would be bloody and very long. And so similar negative consequences would occur. Even ignoring the human costs, there would be long-term economic consequences should the United States delve into violent rebellion, even to oppose fascism and to oppose human rights abuses. I think another lesson to be learned from the Singing Revolution is that it's important to draw on a shared culture to build unity. And this is an issue that liberals get very wrong and conservatives get very right. Frankly, culture matters because it creates a shared identity for people to draw upon. Now, the far right and the fascist would say that this culture is built on a white identity. And I disagree strongly with that. This shared culture, rather than being based on race, instead should be drawn on founding principles that everyone should be able to agree on. More specifically, as Americans, I think that we should all be broadly supportive of the principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and that all people are endowed by certain rights that were outlined more specifically by the Bill of Rights. This shared identity and support for civil rights and liberties is at the core why the United States is able to function as a democracy. And I think it's important that we return to these shared cultural roots and identity if America is to be successful in shifting the tone away from fascism. Notice that I said shifting the tone away from fascism. I think that conservative viewpoints and Republican viewpoints are very important for our democracy to continue to exist. But it's vital that we shift away from the fascist aspects that have co-opted the Republican Party. The second example I want to talk about is the transition from dictatorship to democracy in Spain. And I think this is an example that a lot of Americans don't really know about. For context, Franco became dictator of Spain after a brutal civil war from 1936 to 1938, which involved various political factions. And it's not a coincidence that this civil war occurred about the same time as fascism was rising in other parts of Europe. The Franco dictatorship, unlike Germany, stayed in power until 1975 when Franco died. Between 1975 and 1980, there was major political instability, which included political violence. And there were 460 politically motivated deaths between 1975 and 1980 in Spain. And so I think there was a general fear that Spain would fall back into a second civil war, now that there was no longer a dictator to essentially maintain power through brute force. And there was a general attitude to forgive those involved in the crimes of the Franco regime. In fact, there was a democratic legislature that began in 1977 and a constitution outlining citizen rights in Spain that was passed in 1978. And the Franco regime essentially voluntarily shifted away from a dictatorship towards democratic governance. Certain cultural aspects of the Franco regime remained, such as street names and statues. And amnesty was granted to members of the Franco regime and were allowed to participate in the democratic process. Basically, they exchanged amnesty for democracy. Now, I think it's important to recognize that Spain in recent times has attempted to remember the history and the crimes of the Franco dictatorship. Because the reality is that there were grievous crimes committed by the dictatorship, as there always will be and have been for all dictatorships. But the only way that Spain was able to shift to this democracy as quickly and as peacefully as they did was by reaching this compromise. And so in a sense, the Spanish transition to democracy by offering this quote-unquote forgiveness and amnesty for the crimes of the Franco regime was a pragmatic compromise. And I think there is a lesson for America in this context. Now, obviously, I think there's a great danger in ignoring history, which is kind of what happened in Spain. People just simply did not talk about the crimes that occurred under the Spanish dictatorship. And I don't think we're to that point in the United States. I would argue that fascism has arisen under the Trump administration, but we're not quite to the point where Trump has been able to implement widespread violence against his political opponents. Not to say that he hasn't tried, but he's not to that point yet. But there's a lesson for America in the sense that for democracy to thrive, there has to be a functioning conservative party. In other words, there needs to be a functioning Republican Party. And again, I want to reiterate that I think it's a mistake to forget history, because by forgetting history, we risk repeating the mistakes of the past. But I do think that there has to be a reconciliation that allows space for members of the Trump administration to continue to be part of politics. Now, there's just one key part that plays a part of this reconciliation that the Trump administration must do if they want to continue to play a part in American politics. And that is to completely and avowedly reject the fascist ideology. In order for this reconciliation to occur, the Republican Party and the Trump administration must reaffirm their commitment to democracy that historically both Democrats and Republicans supported. In essence, we need to return to a debate in America where we disagree on what the best path forward for our country is, but that we recognize that to create that ideal path, whether or not you are a liberal or conservative, a Republican or Democrat, that we're able to implement these ideas in a democratic government. In other words, we recognize that everyone has certain rights that ought to be upheld, and for our democracy to function, everyone should support those basic rights. Without that renewed commitment, there can be no reconciliation. And I think that's an important lesson for specifically the No Kings protesters to understand. Now, I think it's obvious for anyone that's been paying attention to the No Kings protests that most of the organization has been by left-wing groups. But if the No Kings protest is to be successful in their aims of stopping authoritarianism, they need to keep a narrow focus. I would warn that we should not be distracted by these other issues, because again, in order to create reconciliation, we have to create an environment where there is unquestioned support for American democracy and for rights that all citizens have in order for a functioning democracy to continue to exist far into the future. And I say that as someone who's participated in the No Kings protests. The third example I want to talk about is 1987, specifically Chile's return to democracy. More specifically, in September 11th, 1973, after major economic turmoil, i.e. major inflation, a military coup essentially took over the government of Chile and deposed democratically elected Salvador Allende. Now, for context, the opposition party had won their version of congressional elections, but the coup still happened to remove Salvador from power. And so as part of this military coup, there were mass executions of left-wing supporters by a national police force. 7 years later, in 1980, the dictatorship of Chile, the Pinochet regime, said they would allow a referendum on the dictatorship that was to occur in 1988. And this was not an election, but it was intended to be a referendum on whether or not the people approved of the military's control of the government. Even despite this unique implementation of seeking the approval of citizenship, the military was still deployed against mass protests against the dictatorship. And so despite this, the referendum still occurred on October 5th, 1988, and 54.7% of the voters chose not to support Pinochet. Surprisingly, Pinochet agreed not to run for office, but he maintained military leadership for an additional 8 years. So in other words, he gave up his civilian power, but still maintained his power over the military. And so, again, this was surprising that a dictatorship would even hold a referendum. But I think the major lessons for America today are that we need to prepare for violent opposition. I've already mentioned a couple of circumstances where Trump has essentially shifted the priorities of immigration officers and has essentially turning them into a paramilitary force. And I think it's important that we're prepared to face violent opposition. But it's still important, despite facing violence, to continue to fight for democracy, especially in preparation for a transition back to normalcy. In other words, I think it's important for those that oppose fascism to be ready to transition back to normalcy, back to democratic norms where democracy can thrive. So I've talked about some historical examples of how people have successfully overthrown their authoritarian governments in order to restore or implement democracy. But now I want to talk about the 3.5% rule in nonviolent action. In other words, what can we do and what exactly is this 3.5% rule that I'm referring to? So there was a study done by an academic researcher. I believe they were a political scientist. They did a broad study of different movements to overturn or overthrow leaders. And they found that at its peak, if a movement has sustained participation by 3.5% of a population, that no government has, in essence, withstood a challenge of 3.5% of their population mobilized against a government during a peak event. And so I think it's important to recognize that there are limitations with this study. Most importantly, this is not a single event. Rather, it is sustained action. In the United States, that means that there needs to be approximately 12 million people participating in the resistance. And I think it's important to acknowledge that that's really hard to do. 3.5% doesn't sound like a lot, but coordinating sustained action by 12 million people in the United States is going to take work and a lot of effort. It's possible, it's attainable, but it's very difficult to do. I think it's important to realize that 3.5% study was historical. In other words, it's not a guarantee of success. Instead, that 3.5% number should be used as a general rule of thumb, that basically as a movement gets 3.5% or more peak popular participation, that those movements have all succeeded. More specifically, all campaigns surpassing the 3.5% threshold were primarily nonviolent. And so this kind of builds off of why nonviolence works. And this is completely ignoring the moral principles of nonviolence. You don't have to believe in nonviolence to realize that nonviolence is more effective when fighting authoritarian regimes. The reason why nonviolent campaigns work is that it draws more people to support the campaign, and so therefore increases your likelihood of reaching that 3.5% peak participation. And so there are a few core reasons why nonviolence works, but there are also other important factors. Number one, it causes disruption. There's a disruption to normal everyday life that causes people to think about what's happening. The second reason why nonviolent protest works is that it helps grow public support far quicker than a violent resistance would ever have. And then finally, a nonviolent approach allows for defections to occur. Defections that I think we're starting to see within the Republican Party, at least in the sense that we're seeing certain Republican senators oppose Trump that wouldn't have happened otherwise. I think it's important to realize that there were also other important factors that influence whether a campaign is successful or not. Mainly the academic study that talks about the 3.5% rule acknowledges that leadership and organization matters. The idea that there can be a completely pure, non-centralized movement driven by online organization is patently not going to work. You have to have leadership because leadership helps drive the direction of a movement, and leadership helps people realize where actions can be taken to create change. And finally, I think another really important takeaway from the academic researchers that came up with this 3.5% number is that violent movements tend to lead to poor outcomes, at least within the context of human rights and civil rights. In other words, violent movements tend to lead to authoritarian takeovers. Non-violent protests are far more likely to lead to increased freedom and increased democracy. Frankly, as this applies to the United States, number one, I think it's important to remain peaceful because, again, as these researchers have shown, peaceful movements draw far more people to support your movement. But we also don't want to replace authoritarianism that has a right-wing bend with left-wing authoritarianism. I think that would be a very big mistake. I think it's important to recognize that violence doesn't just mean physically hurting other people. It also should be understood that violence also includes property damage. And again, if you want to increase the public's support for a movement, you cannot devolve into violence and you cannot devolve into property damage. It will only hurt the movement's cause. So now that I've talked about the success of nonviolent movements, specifically the capacity of a people to overthrow an authoritarian regime, I want to talk about the types of resistance that people can participate in. In other words, what can you do as an individual to stop fascism in America? And ironically, everything that I'm going to talk about realistically doesn't matter at an individual level. And this is the paradox of living or supporting a democratic society. In reality, one person doesn't really matter, but millions of people coming together do matter. Again, this is a paradox, because even starting at the very lowest level, that is voting, individually, realistically, one vote doesn't really matter. In fact, due to gerrymandering, the 2024 congressional elections, 9% of districts were decided by fewer than 5 points. And so again, there's a paradox here. I'm a big fan of economics, and I'm particularly interested in behavioral economics. And no economist would ever advocate for an individual voting because it just doesn't matter. It's not worth taking that time. But again, it's a paradox, because if no one voted, then you would never have the level of effort needed for millions of people to sway an election, because millions of votes do matter. And so on an aggregate grand scale, all of these actions that I'm going to talk about do matter, but they have to be done systematically, and they have to be done from a group perspective. You can't just do things by yourself and expect any change to happen. And so I'm going to outline the types of resistance from the lowest level of effort to the maximum level of effort that are needed to oppose the American shift to fascism. And the first that I've already alluded to is voting. Voting doesn't really take that long. Again, as I've talked about, gerrymandering reduces the true impact of a person's vote. And so, in my opinion, it's actually more important that people vote in primaries rather than just the general elections. And this is assuming that we continue to live in an America where ranked choice voting and other reforms aren't implemented. But in the meantime, I would argue that if you live in an uncompetitive congressional district, one option is to participate in primaries for the dominant party in your area, even if that party tends to oppose your general political views. I think right now that's even more important within the Republican Party, because the Republican Party are the ones who have supported Trump and therefore have supported Trump's fascist ideology. The reality is that the Democrats are not going to stop Trump. It's the Republicans that are going to stop Trump, at least in their fascist shift towards authoritarianism. And as I've mentioned before, it's important that we have a strong Republican Party, or at least a strong conservative party in America, for democracy to function properly. And the next level of participation involves going to local meetings. So I think this is where the impact is probably the greatest, and very few people show up to their local city council meetings, or even to local school board meetings and things like that. I think this is especially pertinent to protests against ICE and Border Patrol. There's this idea that conservatives have floated for a long time that there are something called sanctuary cities. And I think, in essence, the question is, will local law enforcement assist with federal operations? And so whether or not local law enforcement participates or aids federal officers will play a critical role in whether or not Trump is successful in his fascist takeover of America. And that's just one example. There are plenty of other examples where going to local meetings plays a vital role in how people's everyday lives are impacted. One person's voice can matter at the local level that really isn't seen at the federal level. The third form of resistance is protesting. And I speak as someone who has actively participated in protests on and off over the years. Since the latest No Kings movement started, I've been to 4 different protests. And I wanted to share that people are generally welcoming. I know that on the news, there's a lot of attention on when there's conflict between law enforcement and protesters. More specifically, there's been lots of news basically showcasing the fight between protesters and ICE and other federal law enforcement officers. But personally, I haven't seen a single arrest, and I haven't seen a single abuse by police fighting against protesters, including pepper spraying protesters. Now, that might be just because I happen to be in an area where Trump has not basically sent in ICE for escalated raids. But generally speaking, I think that protests are pretty safe in America for now. And even if things were to escalate, there's no shame in individuals leaving a situation that appears to be getting to the point where it's too dangerous for someone to be there. Now, I know that there's lots of cynicism when it comes to protests, in the sense that a lot of times people argue, and I've seen this a lot online, that protests don't matter. But the reality is that protests do matter. As long as the message is targeted, you have to have a unified message. And that's something that I think the No Kings protesters need to focus in on, especially their organizers and leadership. You can only build a broad coalition if you focus the message on promoting democracy, because I think you can find a lot of allies in that movement, even among current Republicans. If the message is targeted, protesters send a message to politicians. In essence, it shows that there is a base of people willing to support a particular issue and who are willing to take broader steps to make sure that that issue is at the forefront rather than just simply voting. But protesting also acts as a signal to other people that may be sympathetic to the movement. And this is another reason why peaceful protest is so important. You cannot build a broad coalition if people are afraid to attend your movement. Really, at the end of the day, people care about their own self-protection, but also the protection of their families. And so when peaceful protest stays peaceful, you're able to build a broader coalition, which at the bare minimum increases the strength of your protest, increases participation in protests, but also increases the number of people who are willing to advocate for that particular issue. I think that it's important to understand that people are not logical in this sense, because if they were logical, then all that would matter would be a debate on the issues. But people like being involved in a movement with other people who share similar viewpoints. And so protests, especially peaceful protests, are one of the best ways to encourage people to join a movement. And so I just want to share some tips that come from the American Civil Liberties Union about how to protest and how to exercise your First Amendment rights. So the first tip is that the First Amendment does not apply to private property. And so if you're going to protest, it's important to stick to public buildings and other public areas like parks and sidewalks. Basically areas that traditionally have been defined as areas of public forums. And that's where your First Amendment protections are strongest. You need to recognize that police can ask protesters to move if they are blocking traffic, and this includes both cars and pedestrians. And I think this is where permits are most important and this applies more to leadership and people organizing protest. You need to get those permits put in place if you're going to have a march on the street, because that enables police to block off traffic. And really, it's in the best interest of all the people involved because it promotes public safety. Another thing that the ACLU points out is that counter-protests are allowed. And so the fact that you're willing to come out and protest in support of democracy, people are allowed to counter-protest. That is their First Amendment right. I would argue, and most organizations leading protests teach de-escalation. And part of de-escalation is not engaging with counter-protesters. And I say that as someone who thinks that there should be more debate in America. There should be honest debate between people with different ideas. But a protest where emotions and tensions are highest is not the best place or time for this debate to occur. And by directly interacting with a counter-protester, all you're doing is increasing the risk of emotions escalating to the point where someone decides to become violent. A far better thing to do is to de-escalate and to not interact with a counter-protester. Finally, the ACLU recommends several things if your rights are violated. And as the United States shifts towards fascism, I think the likelihood of a person's rights being violated increases. The first thing to do is to write down everything you can remember, including officer identifying information, including their badge and patrol car numbers, and the agency they work for. The second recommended step is to talk to witnesses, if you can. The third thing to remember is to not resist. Do not talk to officers to try to defend yourself. If you are arrested, you should assert your right to be silenced and fight for your rights in the courts. Let your lawyer do the arguing. And that's in fact their final recommendation, is to talk to your lawyer. And then finally, the final step of opposing the fascist shift in America involves civil disobedience. And so, barring violent protests, which I've already outlined how that would only hurt our movement's cause in promoting democracy, civil disobedience is the highest risk action. Personally, I'm not willing to engage in civil disobedience yet, because at the end of the day, in my personal life, I'm economically reliant on an employer. I don't make money through this podcast, at least not yet. And so getting arrested would risk my economic well-being. And frankly, I'm not willing to do it. I'm happy if others are able to engage in civil disobedience, but at this moment, I just can't. I'm not to that point. And so I think it's important to remember that by definition, civil disobedience requires participants break the law. This leads to arrests and other punishments. It's key to understand that you can break the law under civil disobedience and stay peaceful. Now, there are different forms of civil disobedience. Some are direct. So think about the Rosa Parks situation, where she sat at the front of a bus, which ultimately led to the Montgomery bus boycotts. But there can also be indirect examples of civil disobedience. For example, sit-ins at government buildings. I think current examples that come to mind for me are those who have protested the United States support for Israel. Now, this is a very different example, but I've seen multiple instances of people sitting in and interrupting Congress as they engage in debates. And there have been many historical examples where civil disobedience has been used to oppose authoritarian leaders. One that comes to mind is Gandhi in India in his opposition to British colonial rule. One specific example of his civil disobedience was his famous 240-mile salt march. For context, British law forbid Indians from producing or selling salt, and Indians were forced to buy heavily taxed imported salt, which caused an unfair burden on people experiencing poverty. And so Gandhi, along with supporters, marched 240 miles and engaged in civil disobedience by basically carrying salt along the way, which by definition violated British law. Another major example was the civil rights movement in the United States. And I would actually argue that the civil rights movement was fighting against a fascist state in the South, segregation, and really, before segregation, I would argue that the Confederacy was fascism in America. And so in order to fight fascism and support civil rights, various civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr. most famously, engaged in civil disobedience. And I think it's important for me to mention, in context of the civil rights movement, that Malcolm X also engaged in civil rights advocacy, including civil disobedience. Although Malcolm X didn't always advocate for peaceful advocacy. But it's a mistake not to mention Malcolm X in the context of the civil rights movement. And so there are several different types of civil disobedience that people can engage in. One example is that I've already kind of mentioned are sit-ins. And so think about the sit-ins that civil rights protesters engaged in during the civil rights movement, specifically at segregated lunch counters. This goes beyond normal protest because the sit-ins, at least the ones from the civil rights movement, occurred on private property. And so protesters were violating segregation laws, but they were doing so in order to advocate for their position. And by acting non-violently, it drew attention to the issue and helped them engage broader support within society. Other types of civil disobedience include vigils, and I think most importantly, boycotts and strikes. Now, boycotts and strikes, there are two different types that are generally used from a civil disobedience standpoint. The two types are one, general, and so that's where you target an overall economy. General strikes have been called for and successfully have been implemented in Minneapolis as part of the anti-ICE protests. But in my opinion, general strikes are not nearly as effective as narrowly tailored strikes. And the reason for this is the same reason why I support nonviolent resistance. General strikes do raise attention to an issue, but they result in broader economic harm. In other words, if a general strike or boycott begins to harm an overall economy, you will have fewer supporters for your movement. This is different from targeted strikes and targeted boycotts, where you target corporations or even public entities who are supporting an ideology or supporting a political idea or philosophy that you oppose. An example that comes to mind is that people boycotted ABC and their affiliated networks, i.e. anyone who owned Disney, in the aftermath of the Jimmy Kimmel debacle. I think that those types of boycotts are much more effective because it targets your message. You are refusing to shop at a corporation or refusing to engage in business with a corporation because of XYZ reasons versus generally refusing to engage in economic activity. And then some other examples of civil disobedience includes walkouts. And these specifically, at least recently, have occurred at schools. As of the time of recording this podcast, I've noticed that high schools and even middle schools have begun to engage in walkouts to protest against the way that ICE has enforced immigration law and the way that ICE has essentially violated citizen rights. And this is a type of civil disobedience that has consequences. I would even argue that schools should enforce their truancy rules just the same on those who engage in walkouts. Why? Because it shows the importance of what these students are fighting for. Again, it raises attention to the issue that you wouldn't get if there was no punishment involved. And then the final type of civil disobedience involves occupations of buildings or land. And so this more relates to not military occupation, but protester occupation. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but Code Pink is famous for implementing these types of occupations in protest against the government. We haven't really seen widespread occupations, especially of government buildings in the United States, but there are plenty of historical examples where these types of occupations have been effective means of civil disobedience. And so that's the final type of action that people can take to fight against fascism and to support a return to democratic norms. If you've made it this far, I want to step back and briefly recap what we've covered. We started with the first trait of fascism, a powerful and continuing nationalism, not simple patriotism, not love of country, but the idea that the nation stands above the individual, above the law, and above other nations. The belief that only a strong leader can restore a country to greatness. History shows us that when power consolidates around one person, and loyalty to the nation eclipses loyalty to constitutional principles, democracy weakens. Second, we talked about a disdain for human rights. Fascist systems treat rights as conditional. Due process becomes optional. Legal protections become obstacles. When governments justify detentions without hearings, ignore court orders, or normalize state violence, that is a warning sign. Rights only remain rights if they apply to everyone, even when it's inconvenient. Third, we examined the identification of enemies and scapegoats as a unifying cause. Fascist movements unite supporters not around shared civic ideals, but around shared hostility toward minorities, immigrants, political opponents, or anyone labeled as the other. Once a group is dehumanized, it becomes easier to justify stripping away their rights. History makes that painfully clear. And fourth, we looked at military supremacy and expansionism, the belief that national strength is proven through dominance, territorial ambition, and the use of force. When a country begins to frame power in imperial terms, when rhetoric shifts towards acquisition and control rather than cooperation and alliance, it increases the risk of conflict, both abroad and at home. These are the 4 traits we cover today. And whether you agree with my specific applications or not, the broader point stands. These patterns are not abstract. They are historical realities, and they have consequences. But here's what history also tells us. Fascism is not inevitable. Authoritarian movements have been resisted before and defeated, not only through war, but through sustained, organized, nonviolent civic engagement. The Baltic states, Spain, Chile, were all movements where ordinary people refused to surrender their democratic institutions. Democracy doesn't die in a single moment, and it isn't saved in a single moment either. It survives when citizens insist on limits to power, when they defend due process, when they reject scapegoating, when they remember that patriotism is loyalty to principles, not to a person. Individually, we may feel small, but collectively we are the Republic. The research on nonviolent movements suggests that sustained participation, even from a relatively small percentage of the population, can change the course of history. The question isn't just whether these four traits are present. The deeper question is whether we, as citizens, are willing to defend the constitutional system that was designed specifically to prevent them from taking root. This has been Episode 2, Preserving the Republic, a Dialogue. I'm Aaron. Thanks for listening, and more importantly, thanks for thinking critically about what kind of country we want to be.